Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Bahriye Goren, and I'm the Interim Academic Director and Clinical Associate Professor for the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department in the Division of Programs in Business at NYU School of Professional Studies. And I'm so excited to welcome you to our book talk about the new book by one of our esteemed faculty members, Professor Matthew Sawyer. Professor Sawyer, welcome. His book is titled Make It in America, and it's about how international companies and entrepreneurs can successfully enter and scale in the US markets. Very, very fascinating topic. It has already ranked #1 in the list of international business books on Amazon. So very, very impressive, and congratulations, Professor Sawyer. A quick background about Matthew. Professor Sawyer is a business and marketing strategist who has helped build dozens of successful brands and startup businesses, both in the US, both US and international companies. He's won numerous marketing industry awards, including gold and silver Effies for most effective advertising campaigns. And he was recognized by the Wall Street Journal as a pioneer in digital marketing. And currently, he's the managing director of the strategy consulting firm Rocket Market Development. And we are so proud that he is one of our faculty members teaching courses in business strategy and marketing communications. And before we dive into the book, I do want to also give a brief background about who we are as a department. For those of you that are joining from outside of NYU SPS, we are a diverse and global community of students, scholars, professionals, and educators. And we really strongly believe that we, as marketing and PR professionals, play a key role in driving business growth. And we have a responsibility in positively influencing societies and economies in a sustainable and equitable way. Our practice of marketing and PR is both human-centered and data-driven. And we're a large group. We're the largest in the country that's specifically focused on master's degrees, focused on marketing and PR, with around 1,200 students in the program across the cohorts and more than 200 faculty members that are practitioners and leaders in the industry. So we're very proud of all of that, of course. During this session, please note that you can add any questions that you have in the Q&A chat box, and we will try to get to all of them or most of them. And with that said, I would like to get started. Professor Sawyer, again, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's so nice to be here. One thing you didn't mention is that I got my graduate degree at NYU. So I have, as I say, I have violet in my veins.
That's wonderful. That's music to our ears. Great. Thank you so much. So before we get into the details and talk about this book, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself? Where are you from and where did you start your career?
Yeah, so I grew up in Boston and then went out to school in Michigan and University of Michigan. And then I came to New York. It was during the 80s and came here to study at NYU. And at that time, all companies were looking for people who had MBAs. And I also didn't have a lot of work experience. So NYU was great in terms of it being really my launching pad. I first started out working in advertising, working on things like light beer from Miller and Campbell Soup. And we helped to introduce Hyundai into the US. And then I went into the client side where I was working for various companies like BIC and Chinet. And at one point I was a vice president of marketing at Snapple, and then had other positions in other agencies and companies. And then about, I guess it was about 9 or 10 years ago, I started this consulting firm and started teaching, first up at Parsons School of Design and then Columbia University. And then I came here to New York, to NYU about 4 years ago.
Wonderful. And we're so glad that you find your way to us. And what are you currently working on? You just mentioned your consulting firm. Could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of work in terms of helping international companies come to the US. And that's really how I got started in terms of doing the book, and saw that there was a real need. It's so confusing and there's just so many potential obstacles that and really just in terms of helping them to identify what's the opportunities, overcoming these obstacles. And most recent project, I helped the Chambers of Commerce, the European American Chambers of Commerce, do a rebranding and helping them become more active here in the United States.
That's great. And you just said it's kind of led you to writing this book, and I said just one sentence about your work earlier, but about the book earlier. But could you maybe explain a little bit more in your own words what this book is about?
Yeah, so it's I'd say almost like a guidebook, but it really sort of helps to identify all of the challenges and the areas that both companies as well as entrepreneurs. There's a special section about entrepreneurs, and it goes into everything from setting up a business, doing financing, what are the talent, finding people, navigating the visa and immigration system, and of course, establishing market presence, which is, the marketing practice. And there's a lot in terms of more explaining rather than sort of how to do it, but more explaining what the situation is and explaining the reasons why the US is in business operates the way it is.
Right. Yes. I mean, as a fairly more recent immigrant myself, having moved to the US in 2008, I can totally see the need for a book like this, kind of just navigating a completely different culture in terms of how people relate, business communication wise, or as you said, hiring practices or getting funding or even networking, right? That's another area that you focused on in your book, kind of how do you network in the US? What would you say, and we'll go into more specifics later, of course, but if you were to give some top line key insights that you derived from all the research that you've done and your own experience leading to this book, what would you say? What are those key insights?
Well, the key insights is really that it's no different than any other company coming here, but just in terms of the main focus is really finding that product market fit, and that's sort of the thing that is the most critical. And in some ways, international companies and entrepreneurs have an advantage because they see the market from an outsider's perspective. They can identify what gaps there are. They can identify opportunities. And the fact is that the United States, people here really love to have things that are new and different. We like to explore things. And there's an openness both in terms of new products, people. One of the things that I was encouraged by is the number of people I spoke to, over 150 people from 40 different countries around the world. And virtually all of them, talked about how the Americans that they met were very helpful and welcoming. Of course, that wasn't 100%, but they were able to find that in navigating through. They found people very helpful here.
Right, and that's kind of a very interesting thing you just said, the word open, right? So there is indeed this openness in the US, something that I noticed myself too when I moved here. But I'm wondering if something else came out of your research too. If you look at New York, for example, people are indeed very open. They'll say, "Hi, how are you doing?" And you go to networking events, and there are a lot of them. If I compare it to Europe, for example, it's less open. But once you make connections, you drill down. And something that I've observed in the US is it's very open, but then it's sometimes harder to drill down to deeper levels, and it takes longer time to actually build the deeper levels of relationships. Is that something that came out of the research that you did, and how does that relate to companies that are entering the US?
Yeah, well, certainly in terms of, and I did there's a whole chapter about understanding Americans. It's actually someone that I had interviewed had said, he was here for over 25 years. He was a Frenchman, has been working here for over 25 years. And he said, I still don't understand Americans.
Uh-huh.
So in terms of the complexity, but I used a lot in terms of established research studies and guides. The Hofstadter had a lot of, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of research that was developed, but also Erin Meyer, who wrote a book called The Culture Map. And she used this analogy of the difference between peaches and coconuts, and that in people in Europe and other countries are more like coconuts, where it's a hard shell, but once you get inside, then it's more open, and as opposed to Americans, where it's sort of it's an easier, softer shell, but then once inside, there's a little bit of a hard nut in the middle. So, I think that every culture is different. I think that's one of the hardest things in terms of identifying, navigating through, understanding in terms of the cultures, the customs. And that seems to be one area that a lot of companies and a lot of international folks really fall down and have the hardest time with.
Right. Yes. And definitely going to ask you a few more questions about that in just a moment, kind of drilling into these cultural differences. But before we do, we just talked about some key insights. Was there anything that was particularly surprising to you as you were writing this book?
I think that it was, in terms of when it was surprising or just sort of encouraging, sort of in particularly this idea of the American dream. And that was something that virtually everyone that I talked to, international coming to the US, had this, knew of it, and sort of had that as a very appealing. And then drilling down into that and sort of seeing how, that really is something that is achievable here. And it's for a lot of people, it's hard. And, certainly one of the problems or the issues is that people are starting at different places, and for some people that have more obstacles and getting up to that, but it is something that is achievable here.
Yes. No, I saw that reading your book, that there were a few case studies that indeed talked about that, and that one of the entrepreneurs actually ended with that, saying it's really true. You can actually achieve that here in the US. That's beautiful. So going into this notion of cultural differences, of course, we could break that down into different aspects, right? One could be more the business culture and how you communicate and relate in a business context. We could also look at it in terms of the target audience, or the consumers in the US are distinctly different from consumers elsewhere. If we start first with the business communication and just how business is done in the US, could you maybe give an example from one of the case studies that was particularly interesting to you?
Yeah, so some of the things that people experienced and talked about was this in terms of, how meetings are done, in terms of, and often that, in the US is that often it'll be like a quick start, how was your weekend? And then immediately getting into business. And that was, something that, people, particularly from Latin America, just weren't used to in terms of establishing more of a relationship. And then you get into, the business. Whereas here, it's almost like, well, let's get the business together. And if we know, if Americans know that you're a party that has something valuable to offer, and there could be a win-win situation, and then the relationship comes afterwards.
Yes.
That was very different for a lot of people. Also things like our legal system is so different. And, one of the things that, particularly with regards to contracts and things here in the US, is that the importance of having written contracts, which is much more different than in other countries, where more of a verbal contracts, are often what's more used in business.
Right. No, I can see some of those clear differences. One thing that I noticed myself coming from a country like the Netherlands was just communication style. So in the Netherlands, it's actually a form of respect to be very direct with someone, for example. So if you're in a meeting and say you have a different opinion, then you literally say that, like, hey, I think this and this, or I disagree. You can actually use those words. And it's not that you can't do that here in the US, of course, but there is a kind of a different way of doing that, right? Kind of where it's a bit more softer, I guess, in how you bring that message, or you do it one-on-one versus in a meeting with others.
Yeah.
So that's
Well,
kind of
actually, it goes to one of the courses that I was teaching was this is a course at NYU, which is about internships and sort of how do you give and receive feedback.
right,
And when in the US, it's almost like you say two nice things, and then you bring up something that might be a negative. But if
right,
you just say the negative, whereas, as you had mentioned in the Netherlands and in Sweden, where it's much more in terms of this frankness, because it's more of that respect, I respect you enough that you can handle the truth.
right, right.
Whereas here, Americans feel the Dutch are. I worked for a Dutch company once, and it was really, a beginning of. It seemed almost brutal in terms of this, this immediate criticism. But it was, that was a sign of respect.
Yeah, it's just different communication styles indeed. And that actually I think makes it so interesting, right, to work internationally. And what I loved about the perspective in your book is that it's not only for people coming from abroad to the US, but it's actually also for people in the US that work with more international folks to get kind of more of that mutual understanding and yeah, so very, very, very cool. And in
Yeah.
terms of the consumers, right? So we just talked a little bit about differences and culturally speaking, in terms of the business language and whether it's legal contracts and things like that. What did you notice about when you actually go out there as a company and you are now trying to appeal to the US market and the US consumer? What were your key findings there?
Yeah, well, a lot of it, and also from experience that I've had in terms of, in marketing and in brand management and working, with companies, is that, here in the US, there is the amount of options that consumers and businesses have. They have so many more options. And so there's a higher degree of the threshold in terms of what needs to be achieved in terms of, if something is, you're not going to buy it if it's okay. They want something that fits their needs and provides real value. Whereas, so I think that the level of competition, both among companies and then also among products, is much higher here.
Right. So you really here need to have a unique selling point or something that differentiates you or makes you stand out from
Yeah.
the sea of many, many offerings. That's what
Right.
I'm hearing. Any other things in terms of just cultural differences, like kind of who the decision maker is in the in the buying process to
Yeah.
for example, I noticed a very key difference when I moved here is that the advertising, and I've worked for global brands where
Right.
we really adjusted it, actually the tone of voice and even the humor. The humor in the US is very, sense of humor is very different. So in a lot of commercials use sense of humor, but a lot of the commercials you see here would really not work in Europe and vice versa, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any
Yeah,
thoughts
actually,
on
it's really interesting. So one of the groups that I worked with that was very helpful in terms of the book was the Hofstede Insights. And that was a group that uses the research that was done by originally by Gerda Hofstede back in the 1970s, where they started it.
Fear
And then,
Hofstede?
yes, and then has continued to be, and now it's over 100 countries that they look at the cultural differences between different countries, and they've done this research. It's this huge database over 30, 40 years. And then this group, the Hofstede Insights, works with companies like Mercedes and Unilever and all sorts of major companies to try to really understand, those differences in the different countries. And you're absolutely right that things that work in, some countries, don't work in the other. So for example, one of the things that's very different is what they call the power distance, how much the people in the society expect or are comfortable with the fact that there is a big difference between people in a higher level of power and people at a lower level. And so countries like the United States, it's more of a egalitarian, as opposed to countries, let's say India, where there's much more of a power distance. And so that, in terms of how things get communicated, even the type of cars. I've heard the story where Mercedes was looking into introducing sports cars, into India and some other countries. So there was a high power distance and expensive sports cars, and they didn't really go over as well. And partly because in those countries, that status is having a driver and then having the person in the back of the car. And so larger cars where there was much more of a distance were things that were more better selling, or those in terms of particularly among the more affluent.
Fascinating. Yes, that's yeah, that of course can impact tremendously in say the car industry, but many others as well. And it's all relative, of course, right? Because, for example, you just mentioned the power distance kind of being at a lower scale in the US, whereas in a lot of Northern European countries, it's even lower than the US, for example. So it's
in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, it's very much in terms of even more egalitarian.
Exactly.
I met someone who had been an executive at a large Dutch drug company, and he was riding his bicycle to work every day, and then they transferred him to Japan. And so he was riding his bicycle into work and going up with everyone, and they thought he was nuts.
Yes.
It was, how can you, you're the president of this division, how can you be riding your bicycle? That was totally, they just didn't accept that.
No, our prime minister has always prided himself on riding his bicycle to the parliament. So it's very true. And also, I think one of those dimensions of Geert Hofstede that you just mentioned, that I think is where the US, I think, also somewhat sticks out, is the one around individualism, right? So if you compare the US to other countries, you see that there are far higher levels of individualism versus countries that have the more collective in mind. How do you see that translating into a business context? Because you do talk about how networking is, so key here in the US and kind of your business off the ground. And with that higher levels of individualism, what is your advice there for people from abroad trying to?
Well, in lots of different levels, and so certainly in terms of one of the problems or the issues that a lot of companies have in terms of, managing their US employees. And, so for example, particularly countries like France, and where management is much more hands-on, and it's we would call it more micromanaging, whereas here in the US, people like to have, okay, give me a goal and then let me go off and do it myself, because there is that individuality. And then we're of all of the countries, we're virtually at the top with regards to individuality. And, and certainly in terms of, from a consumer perspective, buying things for themselves and for their immediate family, that's something that, marketers and companies need to just address and understand, as they're trying to come here.
Right. So fascinating. So what would you say, or how do you think marketing leaders can make some of these key insights that we just discussed and that you go into more detail in your book, of course, how can they make them actionable?
Well, I think it's really in terms of, and one of the fun part for me about the book is that at each chapter, there's a case study, that goes into their company. Some cases they were successful, a few others that weren't so successful. And for the most part is that, really coming here and understanding what it is, hiring local talent, both in terms of whether it's consultants, certainly in terms of lawyers, working with local finance people, really understanding that. So that I think is one of the key things. And then, really addressing, not thinking. There's one case study about the British company Tesco, which is a large supermarket, at the time was the largest supermarket chain in England and one of the largest in Europe. And then they came to the US and they basically tried to replicate what they were doing in England with these small stores with packaged foods. And it was, a disaster, as opposed to another company that's featured in the book, Italy, that came here and really understood what was going on. Of course, they brought their own uniqueness in terms of this combination of entertainment, food, and education, but they also address the local market and even, gets very involved in local suppliers. So they really understood and took the time to really both adapt to what's happening, listen, and then adjust to it as well.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Those are, great examples. And, kind of tying into that, talking about examples, when I teach innovation, I always say we learn the most from our failures, right? Kind of like if you look at Tesco versus Italy, other companies can really kind of, see the difference and learn from, in this case, something that Tesco have missed. Do you have any other examples about kind of just maybe failures? Sounds very negative, but something that others can learn from?
Well, it's funny that you asked that, because I actually have a little couple of slides of a case that I wanted to just share.
Sure.
Let me just see here. And then, so this is a case study. It was a German company, Menck Fenster. Fenster means window in German, and it was a 130-year-old manufacturer of fine windows and doors, and it had been selling in the US through distributors for several decades. And based on some success, they felt, well, there's a huge opportunity. The US is the largest market in the world. And certainly that in terms of construction and things that, it's a great market. So in 2015, they formed a joint venture with another German company, a logistics company, and then came to the US, established a US entity, which is really important, which is also covered in the book. And they opened up a factory in Western Massachusetts, in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and they built a $10 million factory, a state-of-the-art factory. And they were funded they had received a lot of money from the state of Massachusetts, and city tax incentives. They also received a tax-exempt bond. So there was a lot of incentives to come. They built, as I mentioned, they built this beautiful factory of the future. And interesting is the CEO who had come over from Germany was talked about, how that in the window manufacturing was 10 years advance in Europe than it is to US. And so they were going to bring those advances in terms of technology and energy efficiency to the US. And they thought it was going to be, just an automatic win. But in 2017, just 2 years afterwards, they ended up closing the factory. Sales were too slow. It was more expensive to manufacture here. It took too long to set up. And the banker said that this investor said, well, we don't really see a return on investment. And so they took the money out and stopped. So that brings the question is that, well, what went wrong for Menck? And so a couple of things is the first is that in Europe, that the types of windows that are used in Europe are these tilt and turn that comes into the room. Where in the US, we use either casement windows that go out or double hung windows. So they didn't really understand or meet and the other part of it was, and it's still true, but not to this extent, but back in 2015 and 2016, energy costs were twice as much in Europe as they were in the US. So Americans weren't going to be paying 2 to 3 times as much for the windows because it would take too long in terms of repaying on their investment. The other thing that they found out is that the skilled labor that they needed to manufacture these, to use these sophisticated pieces of equipment, they weren't able to find a ready pool of talent, so that they ended up having to train people. And it took another 4 to 6 months to be able to train people to be able to use the equipment. So all of these things that came into it. And so some of the lessons that came from this is that they needed to investigate the size of the market. They, as opposed to this, certainly the window market is huge here, but the amount for high quality wooden windows was small. Really understanding what US customers want, the importance of the talent pool, and then requiring the local experts and advisors.
Right. Yes. I mean, those are such important learnings. One of the things I talk about in my class with students when we talk about international marketing, based on personal experience, launching Ben & Jerry's across Europe, is work with local people. So really have local people in the management, and key experts as advisors that know these differences, right? Like something as simple as which direction the window tilts was actually completely preventable if you had spoken to someone, right? Or really brought someone on the team. And then in our case, for example, we noticed this was mid-2000s, for example, where Ben & Jerry's was more focused on political, social causes, for example. And in Europe at that time, mid-2000s, was already a huge wave around climate change. And it wasn't yet as big in the US. So, but we translated it and did a huge campaign in Europe around climate change. And that was right around that time that Al Gore actually had lost in the US because he was campaigning on that topic. So, again, like a key difference by having the management actually be local people, or at least a mix versus. And
that's a good example because the timing is so important too.
Yeah.
Because those issues, in terms of what's important, whatever, it's like, countries and people, there's a timing, and finding the right time to enter is also an important, one of the other things about Menck is that they came in, it was 2015, and the country still hadn't fully recovered from the credit crisis in 2008 and 2009. So building was not, it was coming back, but it wasn't as robust as other periods of time, like right now.
Right. Yes. So true. I think timing is one of those things. I mean, it is a tough one because a lot of things are also easily explained in hindsight, right? Because we all kind of learn as we go, and when you look back, the signs are much clearer. But still, as you said, at that time too, if it's 2008, 2009, it was a huge crisis. That's just kind of very true. So what would be the next steps for you around this topic, or in general? Are you going to have a sequel for this book, or what are your next steps?
Well, right now I'm focused in, and the book just launched. Actually, yesterday was the official launch date, so I'm really moving forward. And so I'm actually taking a page from, there's another NYU professor, Dr. Christian Bush, who wrote the book, The Serendipity Mindset, and sort of looking as things come up and just being open to opportunities and seeing things. And I just have this, I know that there's going to be things that come out in terms of meeting people and seeing opportunities. And I'm just, I haven't I'm open to seeing where that I have that serendipity mindset. So
Sure.
we'll have to get back, and I'll let you know what where this has led.
Right, right. No, I can totally see. I mean, uh, as we already saw, you already made the #1 list in the international business books so quickly, and of course those lists keep evolving. But yes, I
Yeah.
think there's a lot to be done around this book and getting into getting the word out.
Yeah.
One other question, one other aspect we haven't touched on, but I'm still quite curious, is that I mean, my family and I, we recently moved back to New York, but we had a 7-year stint, so to speak, in Colorado. And in many ways, it felt like I had moved country because the state of Colorado and just even from climate, but also culturally felt quite different from New York, and the East Coast, I feel is more similar. Do you address that in the book, or how does
Yeah,
that fall into?
absolutely. And it's actually one of the biggest misconceptions. I remember speaking to someone in Australia, and he was talking about, he had a company that was in the energy field. And, he said, oh, we're going to come to the US because it's, one big, huge market. Everyone speaks the same language. It's one government. And so huge misperception, because in fact there's hundreds of smaller markets here. You have your 50 states, each with its own set of laws and regulations that need to be addressed. But I also talked from a cultural perspective too. So there was a book that I referred to called American Nations, and about looked at the origins of the country, where it was different groups that came in and started in 11 different cultural regions, that then started like up in Boston with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, which were very different than in New York, which was the Dutch that came here, for trading. And it was, a totally different mindset in terms of and how it was perceived. And those cultural patterns, kept for at least another 150 years, and that those patterns still are true. And there's been some migration, but it is addressed in terms of looking at those differences from the origin, and that's trying to explain why it's different based on the origin of the different regions.
Right. Yes. Yes. No. Completely agree. It is always very I would call it interesting or fascinating how people outside of the U.S. think of the U.S. as one big,
You
kind of
know,
country. Of course, it's a country, but it's very different. It has very key differences across the states, across the coasts, across across the states borders, I guess. Very, very interesting. Let's see if we have a few questions from participants. I don't see any in the Q&A box, but this would really be a good time to put in some questions if there are any. So let's give it maybe a couple of minutes to see if any questions trickle in. What would you say to our students, Matthew, if any of our students, being relatively younger, but they have an amazing business idea and maybe they grew up somewhere else in the world, what would be kind of your key 3 pieces of advice to them?
well, the first thing, and then I do have, as you know, we have a lot of international students here at NYU. And the first thing I do is that I try to really encourage them in terms of saying, it is difficult. There are obstacles, getting through, the immigration and visa system and things like that, which it isn't easy. And getting started isn't easy, but there is a huge upside. And so to really be not discouraged by obstacles that come up, because at the end of the day is that so many people that I talked to said they were so proud and that they were able to, make it in America and find their American dream. And the other thing was really interesting is that in talking to people, and their American dream was different for different people. And that's one of the things that's really nice or great is that you can choose what it is, whether it's, to be financially extremely wealthy, that could be your dream, or it could be to make a real impact in terms of the society, or it could be to be well respected, could be
Yeah.
to have a nice family. You can choose what that American dream,
I love that.
for yourself.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
true. So true, right? Kind of I always say to my students, kind of always have your own North Star, and
Yeah.
don't let others define what that North Star is for you,
Yeah. And it was interesting is that in terms of looking at, I also looked at a lot of Pew Research and other research studies. And while the Americans sort of have this reputation of sort of being very materialistic and bling oriented, for the most part is that there were other things that people valued much more so, and that money was relatively low on the totem pole.
That's interesting. That's very fascinating. Um, okay, let me have another look at our chat box. I don't see any other questions trickling in, Matthew. So are there any other parts of the book that you would like to highlight before we end our session today?
No, I just I tried to make it very easy to read. And the other part of it is there are really no rules. I did include both a glossary as well as a checklist for both companies and a checklist for entrepreneurs of just things that they need to just make sure to cover as they're trying to enter into the US. But there are really no rules. It's a way of finding it, and there's every situation is different. But it really takes that investigation, intelligence, being able to really understand what's happening, and it takes a lot of art and skill.
Yes. No, I really think, having kind of a unique position of being someone who came later to the US, and also at some point I had started my own business. Everything you write about in your book is so completely and 100% valid that I really think it's a must read for anyone coming from out of the US, whether you're starting a business or launching a business or working here.
Yeah.
Will benefit from your insights and your wisdom. So I think really great. Thank you
Thank you very much.
well, then, if there aren't any other questions, then I think we will end our session today. I had a one final slide to show everyone, and it's really more to ask you for your thoughts and your opinions about what you thought about this event. You will see a link pop up in your inbox right as we close off. And I want to thank first and foremost Professor Sawyer for taking the time to meet with me today and to share these beautiful insights from your book, and of course for writing the book. Again, I think it'll help so many people. And of course, thank you to everyone joining us today. And I wish everyone a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.